I thought I'd open by just asking, who actually said this? Was it Margaret Thatcher in 1979, or was it Keir Starmer earlier this year? We need a return to good foundations of government, national security, secure borders, and economic stability. And this requires an enduring partnership with business to deliver the economic growth we need. Any guesses? Starmer. It was, of course, Starmer. His Labour Party has been in power for 4 months now, and already it's gone down in history as being the most deeply discredited government in Britain, obviously apart from that of Liz Truss. Not that there was really much enthusiasm for Labour during the election. Despite them winning a landslide, they did so on the lowest vote share of a winning party, I think, in history, on 34%. And it was only really due to the first past the post system that they mopped up so many seats. And actually, rather than any real, genuine groundswell of enthusiasm for Labour, their victory was really just a product of the collapse of support for the Tories. After 14 years of falling living standards, crumbling services, and scandals. Now, Labour has been very clear from the outset that they're at the service of big business. They've been very open about their readiness to take so-called tough decisions, i.e. austerity, and to try and put capitalism back on track. They've said Labour will give no free ride to the unions when it comes to future wage negotiations, anticipating future conflicts. And they've enthusiastically fallen into line behind US imperialism when it comes to their foreign policy, with their unshakable support for the wars in Israel, Ukraine, and nuclear weapons. Now, given Starmer's previous conduct, none of that comes as any surprise to us at all. Indeed, when looking back at the history of the Labour Party in power, I would say Starmer fits in very well. Since Labour first came to power a century ago in 1924, they've been in government for 6 times. Half of those were very weak or unstable minority governments. And one thread that runs through all of them is that despite ostensibly being a party of labour, of the working class, it's always ended up siding with the capitalist class when push comes to shove. And I think if you had to summarise the history of the Labour Party in power, it would be as one of managing capitalism in crisis on behalf of the capitalists. And 3 things really emerge from their whole history. Firstly, despite in 1918 adopting a commitment in their constitution to the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, i.e. kind of moving towards socialism, its leadership has never been serious about actually carrying that out. And in fact, they've all defended the private ownership of the means of production, i.e. the right of a handful of multimillionaires and billionaires to control the economy and exploit the labour of the overwhelming majority. And secondly, and linked to that, is that every Labour government has come into conflict with organised labour, with the trade unions, the very organisations that came together in 1900 to establish the party as their political representation in Parliament. And thirdly, is that every Labour government has carried out an imperialist foreign policy, which, after all, is only an extension of its home policy. As Lenin explained, imperialism is merely the highest stage of capitalism, that of the domination of finance capital, which becomes more and more integrated with the state. Any government that leaves the rule of the imperialists intact, i.e. the rule of the big banks and monopolies, will inevitably find themselves at the head of a machine that is set up to carry out their interests. Now, I want to use this session to give some examples from Labour's history that really show how it has always ended up managing capitalism in crisis. I think examples that will help really put Starmer's Labour government into context. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll have time to go into Labour's many conflicts with the trade unions or its imperialist history, so I'm hoping that some comrades can elaborate that on the discussion. But importantly, I really want to explain why has Labour always behaved the way it has? What really is the nature of the Labour Party? Has it ever really been a socialist party? And therefore, what can we expect from the current Labour government? Now, I think there was a poll earlier this year that found politicians are the least trusted people in British society. And it's long been thought, actually, that politicians will say anything to get elected, and then once in power, do completely the opposite. Now, is that fair? Well, actually, if you look back at the whole history of every Labour government, I'll say with the exception pretty much of the post-war Attlee government, Labour has pretty much failed to carry out its programme. They've all made various promises to get elected, so promising things like, and this is a quote, an irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people. But then when they're in power, they find the cupboards are bare, and that actually we need to make tough choices. And this goes all the way back to the first Labour government in 1924, headed by Ramsay MacDonald, who was one of the founders of the party. The early 20s were characterised by a deep economic crisis following the First World War. It was a period of high unemployment, and stormy strikes as the capitalists demanded that workers tighten their belts in order to restore profitability. And the Tory government called an election for the end of 1923, in which the Labour Party, for the first time in history, came second above the Liberals. And the result was a hung parliament with the Liberals holding the balance of power. They decided to support a minority Labour government instead of propping up the Tories, thinking that if they did so, Labour would be too weak to really do the capitalists much harm, and as a result, they would quickly discredit themselves in power. And they turned out to be precisely right. The Labour leaders relished that opportunity to prove themselves as responsible statesmen. Cabinet Minister Margaret Bonfield said, "We've taken over a bankrupt machine, and we have got to try and make that rickety machine work." Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister, said, "I want to gain the confidence of the country and shall suit my policy accordingly." Now, of course, when he said the country, what he really meant was the capitalists, the landowners, big business, and the middle-class hangers-on. They implemented orthodox capitalist policies in a bid to restore profitability. And they used the excuse of in office but not in power to effectively abandon their programme. They did implement some minor reforms when it came to benefits and housing with support from the Liberals, but nothing too radical. There was certainly no talk of socialism. And after only 10 months in power, a section of the establishment decided that Labour had served its purpose and moved to bring down the government, which they successfully did with a motion of no confidence. Now, on his way out, the King, George V, told Ramsay MacDonald that he would always regard him as a close friend, which really, I think, sums him up and tells you everything you really need to know about him. Now, that whole episode was really just a dress rehearsal for the next Labour government, which came to power in 1929. Again, although Labour had massively increased its vote share, it was again a minority government which was being held up by the Liberals. Now, there were some from within the Independent Labour Party, which was actually one of the component kind of organisations of the Labour Party, who were calling for Labour to actually put forward a socialist programme to Parliament, invite the opposition to vote against it, and then when they inevitably did, and they were defeated, they could go back to the polls and say, this is what we stand for, we mean business, and try and win a majority on that basis. But of course, Ramsay MacDonald rejected that strategy completely out of hand and climbed into bed with the Liberals. Now, the government enjoyed a very short honeymoon period before then the impact of the Wall Street crash spread around the world. And unemployment almost tripled over the course of 18 months to reach 2.7 million by December of 1930. And by early 1931, it was very clear to everyone that a budgetary crisis was looming. The Unemployment Benefit Fund was in debt by £70 million and rapidly rising. Now, that doesn't sound like very much to us today, but it's the equivalent of nearly £6 billion. And the government was effectively paralysed. They were unable to pass any legislation. Meanwhile, the TUC, which is the umbrella organisation of the trade unions, was disillusioned by the government, of course, given its failure to do anything about unemployment or implement any of the reforms that it promised in its programme. And the government had actually indeed sponsored wage-cutting settlements to industrial disputes. And as such, some unions even refused to hand over their affiliation fees to the party. Now, in July, a parliamentary committee on national expenditure recommended deep cuts to public spending, including a 20% cut to unemployment benefit in order to balance the books. And the Labour cabinet sat on that until the run on the pound forced their hand in August. And then the cabinet agreed to quite a deep package of austerity, but they stopped short of cutting unemployment benefit. Now that, of course, was rejected by the opposition parties, the Tories, the Liberals, as well as the bankers, who demanded much deeper cuts. So MacDonald approached bankers in New York, essentially asking if they would financially support the pound and the government if they would be prepared to implement a 10% cut to unemployment benefit. And their answer was probably yes, so MacDonald put that to his cabinet. But the Labour Party itself was deeply split over this issue. Labour had, of course, campaigned on a programme of work or full maintenance for the unemployed, and this was now to be sacrificed for the purpose of saving capitalism. The TUC rejected the cuts out of hand, but they didn't offer any alternative. And 9 of the 20 cabinet ministers, really feeling the pressure from the ranks of the movement, rejected these additional cuts. So with the government fatally split, MacDonald went to the King to tender his resignation. But the shrewd strategists of capital said, well, hang on a minute, cuts of this scale would be far better if implemented by a so-called socialist prime minister rather than a Tory. And they thought it would be more palatable to the working class, as well as ward off the danger of Labour benefiting from being in opposition while the Tories carried out such a programme. And indeed, this is actually what a section of the capitalist press had been calling for some time, which was for the so-called national government to come to power in the so-called national interest. So, of course, MacDonald was then instructed by the King to form what they called a national government, whose cabinet included 4 Labour ministers, 4 Tories, and 2 Liberals. Now, obviously, when they talk about the national interest, what they really mean is the interest of the City of London, the big banks and big business. They wanted a strong, stable government to manage capitalism in a period of deep crisis. So, although a number of the most right-wing Labour MPs defected to join this government, most of them actually stayed in the Labour Party, lest it fall into the hands of the lefts. And therefore, Arthur Henderson, who was this arch right-winger and one of the founders of the party, ended up leading the party. And at the next election in 1931, he offered no alternative to the discredited record of Labour in power, which had really been one of massive skyrocketing unemployment and attacks on working class people. And as such, the party was hammered in the election and actually lost most of its MPs. And incidentally, that actually meant the shift in the balance of power within the party actually went more to the left, as a lot of the right-wingers were booted out. And the left kind of took the leadership of the party for the rest of the 30s. But meanwhile, this national government actually remained and survived in one form or another throughout the 30s and actually up until the end of the Second World War, which was almost 14 years later. Now, I want to come back to the post-war Labour government in a bit more detail later on, as it's broadly the exception to the rule that Labour's abandoned its programme when in power. But the reason that it could get away with quite serious reforms is that it came to power at the beginning of a massive boom for capitalism worldwide. Lots of unique factors came together to make that possible. There was the enormous destruction of the war, which really wiped out the overproduction of the 1930s and necessitated massive reconstruction. There was the high demand for labour, resulting in full employment, which put workers in a very strong position. There was an enormous expansion of world trade. And there was also, importantly, the emergence of the USA as the world's #1 imperialist power, which was in a position to bankroll governments across Western Europe in order to prop them up. Now, the war in Britain cost Britain a quarter of its total wealth, and it relied heavily on US loans in order to see it through. Now, it relied on this Lend-Lease program, which was abruptly terminated at the end of the war, which left the Labour government high and dry and in a complete crisis. So a delegation was sent to the USA to agree a £3.8 billion loan, which is worth £2.6 billion today, so an incredible amount. And it, of course, came with heavy strings attached. Now, one of these was to make pound sterling fully convertible by mid-1947. And what that effectively meant was opening up the British market to the world market, and American imperialism in particular. And it effectively bought them some time then to carry out their program, because without that loan, imports would have had to be drastically cut, meaning a complete collapse in living standards. But by mid-1947, when sterling was indeed made convertible, the pound collapsed. And convertibility had to be abandoned, and the government then introduced a number of austerity measures, kind of rolling back on their program. They were rescued in 1948 with another massive loan from the US under their Marshall Aid program. But nevertheless, in 1949, another wave of this kind of budgetary crisis emerged, forcing the supposedly left-wing Chancellor Stafford Cripps to devalue the pound and implement a wage freeze. And the so-called lefts rolled back on their previous ideas of trying to introduce elements of planning into the economy, as they felt that they didn't want to antagonize the capitalists who they thought they needed to try and their support to ride out the crisis. Now, that dynamic would be repeated during the subsequent Labour governments in the 60s and 70s. So, for example, Howard Wilson was elected to power in 1964. After 13 years of Tory rule, he promised an era of new change based on unleashing the potential of new technology and economic planning. But soon after his election, he was summoned to a meeting by the governor of the Bank of England, who told him that there was in fact an £800 million trade deficit. And he said that the country couldn't afford Labour's programme, and if Wilson persisted with it, he would face a run on the pound and financial ruin. So instead of exposing this corporate conspiracy and mobilising workers to actually take socialist measures against the bosses, Wilson dutifully bent the knee to the diktats of the bankers and bosses. And in 1965, the government moved to reduce government spending through orthodox cuts and the introduction of what they called a prices and incomes policy. which included a program of voluntary wage restraint as its first phase. And what that really amounted to was an attempt by Labour to boost profits at the expense of wages, with Labour effectively acting as the agents of the capitalists. Now that still didn't satisfy the capitalist class. In 1966, following Wilson's re-election, he agreed to a much severer deflationary package, which included a statutory wage freeze for 6 months, so-called productivity deals in order to boost profits. And after much talk about planning, his so-called national plan was abandoned in the summer of 1966. And this was really a confirmation of the anarchy of the market, the fact that you can't plan what you don't control. And actually, with the vast bulk of the economy in private hands, it was the market that dictated to the government and not the other way around. Now, the respite was only temporary. In 1967, the government finally buckled under enormous pressure from the markets to devalue the pound. And in theory, the bosses of British industry could have used that opportunity to become more competitive abroad. But in fact, they just simply raised their prices, and as a result, their share of world exports continued to fall and imports to Britain rose. Now, although the massive profits rose over that period, average profit margins actually fell, which reflected a falling rate of profit at that time. And the government attempted to counter this by boosting profits at the expense of the living standards and working conditions of the working class. Now, it is true that the Wilson government in the 60s did introduce a number of kind of liberal social reforms, such as the decriminalisation of homosexuality and abortion, the abolition of the death penalty, and easing restrictions on divorce and some other measures. And these gave it a certain progressive veneer. But at the end of the day, they didn't cost the government anything, and they certainly didn't threaten capitalism. But when it came to economic policy, however, the government introduced a number of cuts and counter-reforms. For example, prescription charges were reintroduced, access to welfare was tightened up, and their wage restraint continued. In fact, the government then attempted to pass anti-union legislation, which would severely limit the ability of unions to strike, following Employment Minister Barbara Castle's infamous report, In Place of Strife. And this caused absolute outrage within the Labour movement and a split within the Labour Party. The TUC felt the pressure from below and came out in opposition, and there was actually a mass campaign of resistance organised by trade union militants. So on May Day of 1969, 1.25 million workers took political strike action to kill the bill, and it was combined with mass demos across the country. Now, although the government passed the legislation, 55 Labour MPs voted against it and another 40 abstained, and combined with massive pressure from the ranks of the movement, the government was effectively forced to abandon the law. Now, all of that had a really demoralising effect on a layer of the working class who felt really betrayed by this government. And the vision of a new society that was presented by the party in 1964 had clearly crumbled upon contact with the needs to manage capitalism in crisis. And as such, the party lost the 1970 election to the Tories as a result of a large number of Labour abstentions. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details, but pretty much the same dynamic played out with the subsequent Labour government from 1974 to 79. The Tories provoked a miners' strike in 74, and they used the opportunity to call an election. And the previous 3 years had actually seen an explosion of the class struggle, especially with the rapid rise of inflation, which followed from the impact of Keynesian deficit financing that really kind of caught up with the economy at that period. Now, the Tories fought the election on the basis of who runs the country, us or the unions. And the result was, clearly not the Tories, as Labour was returned to power, although again as a weak minority government, which they then turned into a slim majority of just 3 a few months later. Now, in the meantime, the party had moved sharply to the left as a result of the radicalisation on the industrial front in the previous years. And in 1973, the party conference actually adopted a programme that included the nationalisation of the top 25 monopolies. Although we should say that actually the executive committee of the party was split on that question, and Howard Wilson was dead against it. The programme also moves to again include the state in elements of planning the economy, as well as price controls on certain goods. But in 1974, upon election, Wilson was again confronted with a strike of capital. And the Confederation of British Industry, the bosses' union, they wrote to Wilson warning of drastic action if the government didn't yield to their demands, which of course Labour did, and the idea of further nationalisations was quietly dropped. And they implemented a form of incomes policy designed to restore profitability, known as the social contract, but which later became known as the social con-trick. It stipulated maximums for wage increases, which the trade unions were supposed to voluntarily adhere to, supposedly in return for the government providing other elements of what they called a social wage, things like rent freezes, benefits, food subsidies, and repeal of the Tories' anti-union laws. But that didn't help the government, which was battered from pillar to post by the crisis of capitalism that gripped the world at that time. So, for example, inflation averaged 9.2% in 1973. It shot up to 19% by the end of 74, and it reached almost 27% by August of 1975. And that, of course, led to increasing bitterness of workers against the trade union and Labour Party leaders who were trying to enforce this policy of wage restraint on behalf of the bosses, which really meant massive cuts to workers' living standards. And later in 1976, another sterling crisis forced the government, now which was under Jim Callaghan, to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a loan. And the IMF demanded the government make cuts of £3 billion to public expenditure, which is equivalent to £27 billion today, which of course the government agreed to. And that really marked the end of the line for this Keynesian policy of deficit financing in order to fund increasing social expenditure. And the social contract was then effectively dead, because you had on the one hand a policy of wage restraint, but combined with massive cuts to social spending in 1977 to 78. So by that point, the unions were no longer able to hold the line in enforcing this policy, and were actually forced to come out against it. So in 1978, there was then an explosion of industrial action, which came to be known as the Winter of Discontent, as workers struck to kind of gain back what they'd lost over the previous years. In the meantime, the government lost its slim majority, and they then quickly lost a motion of no confidence against them in March 1979. So as with Wilson's government in the 60s, the failure of Labour to live up to its promises and its attempts to manage capitalism by attacking the working class had led to widespread despondency against the Labour Party. And that's what really allowed Thatcher to come to power, whose programme was an all-out assault on the trade unions and really all the gains of the working class from the previous period. Now, I think the question that needs to be answered in relation to all of this is, why did Labour behave like this? And for that, it's necessary to understand the nature of the party as well as the limits of reformism. Now, the party's leadership has always had a reformist outlook to one degree or another. The idea that it's not necessary for the working class to take power into its own hands to transform society. Now, some thought that with the correct management, capitalism would just sort of gradually develop into socialism, kind of automatically, just over a long period of time. Others didn't even consider themselves socialists, but just thought that capitalism could be made to work for both capitalists and workers. What united them all, though, was a rejection of the need for revolution. Now, since the defeat of the Chartist movement at the end of the 1840s, the Labour movement in Britain had essentially tail-ended the Liberal Party, which was a capitalist party. But with an explosion of trade union struggles in the 1890s, the demand for an independent party of the working class became more and more pressing. Now, indeed, a few years before that, you had the Social Democratic Federation, the SDF, was established in 1884, ostensibly on a Marxist programme. But it was plagued by sectarianism and really remained aloof from the real movement of the working class. Later in 1893, Keir Hardie founded the Independent Labour Party, the ILP, which campaigned for a political voice for the working class, but it really lacked a mass base within the trade unions. And also politically, it was very weak. It actually rejected the class struggle, and it veered towards opportunism, an accommodation with capitalism and the policies of class collaboration. And as such, it attracted a number of formal liberal types into its leadership, people like Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowden, who would go on to lead the first Labour government. Now, unfortunately, the small circle around Engels at that time was too weak to really influence these developments after his death. And the SDF remained aloof from the ILP, and therefore the leadership was allowed to kind of remain in the hands of these opportunists. In the meantime, the capitalists went on the offensive against the unions, and there were a number of judgments in the courts which sought to limit trade unions' ability to picket or remove their protection from liability to the capitalists for any damages to their profits as a result of strikes. Hence, in 1899, the TUC passed a resolution calling for its parliamentary committee to join forces with the various socialist and cooperative groups in organising a conference to discuss the question of workers' representation in Parliament. And that wasn't really out of so much a desire to create a socialist party, but really just as a means to defend the trade unions from these legal attacks. And that conference did indeed meet in 1900 and resolved to form the Labour Representation Committee, which later changed its name to the Labour Party. And it contained a mixture of different tendencies from the outset. It was always this so-called big tent party. There was a layer that still favoured class collaboration with the liberals. There was also this Fabian Society, which is kind of like a think tank, which was essentially middle-class socialists who rejected the class struggle, and they saw socialism as essentially just something to be implemented from above by some kind of enlightened intelligentsia like themselves. And many of the party's leaders, including Ramsay MacDonald, Clement Attlee, and Harold Wilson, were all from this Fabian trend. There was the ILP tendency, who opposed an alliance with the Liberals, and they really just saw the party as effectively a division of labour between them and the trade unions. They thought the unions would provide the funds, and then the party would just essentially put forward people in Parliament to defend their interests. But in a typically opportunistic fashion, they wouldn't publicly commit the party to socialism in order to try and placate the right wing of the trade union movement. And then there were also the socialists of the SDUF, who did actually initially join the Labour Party at its formation, and they argued for it to be a fully class-conscious socialist party. But ultimately, the ILP trend emerged the strongest at the beginning, and the SDF failed to pass a resolution calling for the party to commit itself to the common ownership of the means of production, and they actually then abandoned the party in what seemed like a very short-sighted and sectarian move. As had they stayed, I think it's likely that ultimately their views would have connected with the ranks of the party over time, especially as the class struggle heated up. So instead, the field was clear for the leadership to be dominated by the opportunist ILP on the one hand and the middle-class Fabians. Now, you could be forgiven for asking, how come a party that was essentially founded and funded by the trade unions could be formed with such an opportunistic leadership? By this point, though, however, most of the trade unions have become incredibly bureaucratized. And actually, ever since the mid-19th century, the capitalists in Britain were effectively able to buy off a section of the working class by throwing them a slice of their profits. And they could afford to do this since they effectively exploited millions around the world through their empire, and British industry effectively held a monopoly position worldwide. So actually, by 1881, Engels remarked that this setup had allowed the situation whereby the worst English trade unions, he said, would allow themselves to be led by men sold to, or at least paid by, the middle class. Now, the leaders' living conditions were far removed from those of the workers they were supposed to represent. And also, the ruling class perfected the art of either indirectly or directly corrupting them, not just financially, but also, most importantly, ideologically. And this was assisted by a general disdain for theory amongst the British ruling class, which was really then passed down into these middle-class leaders in the labour movement. And that itself had material roots, in that British capitalism was really the first to develop and acquired a leading position globally. And the capitalists had no precedent really to follow. They just had to chart their path empirically. And their preeminent position was reflected in their certain contempt for what they saw as so-called foreign ideas. And rather than studying things theoretically, they just got on and did it. Now, that outlook very much characterized the leaders of the Labour Party, who, in rejecting or ignoring the so-called foreign ideas of Marxism, simply adopted the philosophy and prejudices of the capitalists. As capitalism seemed to be developing at that stage, conditions this year seem to be better than the previous year, so why wouldn't they be better tomorrow and the next year? And so all they thought they needed to do was allow capitalism to just run its course, and in time, with the correct people in charge, everyone would be better off, and ultimately poverty would become a thing of the past. And this was part of the same phenomenon that gave rise to the reformist degeneration of the Second International, with figures like Edward Bernstein in Germany. However, in Britain, it wasn't really a degeneration in the sense of them abandoning or revising Marxism, as they were never Marxists or revolutionaries to begin with. Many of these leaders were really petty bourgeois liberals looking to salve their consciences through participation in the labour movement. That was especially the case with the Fabians. Many of the leaders of the Labour Party saw socialism really as just some sort of moral crusade. It was really to them a form of utopia that they just had to convince everybody about how fair it would be, and then it would just pretty much happen. And to them, it wasn't the necessary product of the development of the productive forces, which would at a certain stage compel the working class to take power into its own hands through a revolution. A fair few of them actually saw socialism in religious terms. A great deal of them were Christians of one shade or another, and many of them were indeed former preachers. But there were others who actually started out as workers, but relished the prospect of actually becoming part of the establishment themselves. And that was the case with Ramsay MacDonald and also with Jimmy Thomas, who was the leader of the Railway Union. Together, when they both formed the Labour government, the first one in 1924, they actually delighted in showing up to meet the king in full court dress, to the absolute ridicule and disgust of the Labour movement. Now, it was this setup that led Lenin to characterize the party in 1920, as he said it was actually a thoroughly bourgeois party. He said, yes, it's a workers' party in the sense that its membership is based on the trade unions. They pay the affiliation fees with the expectation that the party will defend their interests, and they can put pressure on their leaders to do so. But actually, if you look at the leaders themselves, they're actually either bourgeois or petty bourgeois themselves, or they're so thoroughly imbued with that outlook that they act in the spirit of the bourgeoisie. So, for example, MacDonald's first cabinet, the first Labour government, it actually included 5 former Liberals, 2 ex-Tories, and 1 actual Tory who was still a member of the Tories. Now, Lenin, of course, had a dialectical view of the party rather than a mechanical one, in that he understood that while the party's leadership, including its guiding philosophy, is crucial for how the party conducts itself, for its programme, its tactics, and so on, it's not a one-way process, and nor is it fixed or given for all eternity. It's a living thing, and there's a battle of living forces within it. And on the basis of an upturn in the class struggle and a radicalisation of the ranks of the movement, the leadership itself can come under pressure to move to the left or even be replaced by those who are more in tune with the ranks. And that was hence why he encouraged actually the young Communist Party of Great Britain, when it was formed in 1920, to actually seek affiliation to the Labour Party. Because Lenin thought that providing the communists were able to maintain their freedom of criticisms of the party's leadership and programme, it would actually then allow the communists to better connect with the millions of British workers who actually had illusions in the Labour Party and who saw it as their party. And by participating in their struggles side by side, they could better expose the rottenness of the leaders and in practice show the superiority of communist ideas and methods. Really, it was an application of the tactic of the United Front to the specific conditions in Britain. Now, unfortunately, the young Communist Party was infected with sectarianism at that time, and they made a number of mistakes in their approach to the Labour Party. But even with the mistakes of the communists aside, the Labour lefts were always historically very weak. Now, it's true that the parties always suffered from a lack of internal democracy, which meant that the MPs, who were overwhelmingly from the right wing, were effectively unaccountable to the ranks. But the real weakness of the lefts, I say, would actually flowed from their lack of theory. Pretty much all of them were infected with the reformist idea that a revolution wasn't possible or necessary, and that socialism would simply just come about as a result of a thriving capitalist economy. So at the end of the day, when the Labour Party was faced on many occasions in its history with the choice of either implementing cuts on behalf of capitalism or facing bankruptcy, the lefts really had no alternative programme to offer. Because if you accept capitalism, you have to accept the laws of capitalism, which are the laws of the market economy. Now, many of them would hide behind the lesser evilism excuse that if they didn't support the cuts, then they would simply be replaced by the Tories who would carry them out. And when the post-war Labour government then nationalised key sectors of the economy, many of these lefts just looked at things on the surface empirically and thought, this is it, we're implementing socialism. And in reality, what happened was the state took over bankrupt sectors of the economy that had been shattered during the war, such as the railways, and they became responsible for the costs of rebuilding and modernising them. At the same time, the former owners were handsomely compensated. About 20% of the economy was nationalised. It was mostly transport, energy, utilities, and some heavy industry. But none of these were put under democratic workers' control, nor were they integrated into a socialist plan of production. And it was, to use the correct use of this term, a form of state capitalism. They were run by management boards, which were often stuffed with the same capitalist directors as before, and they were run as individual profit-seeking enterprises. And that was very much in line with the paternalistic Fabian view of socialism, which feared any independent control or initiative of the working class. They really thought that the capitalist state could just simply be wielded for their purposes, and that it wasn't an instrument of class rule. All of them really fetishized parliament and bourgeois democracy. They thought that you had to play by the rules of the game, and that you can never seek to actually mobilize the masses to carry out their interests. And for a time, the capitalist class and their representatives in the Tories could tolerate this setup, because really it meant to them inputs of cheap energy and raw materials for the bulk of the capitalist economy. But then when the whole system went into crisis in the 1970s, they then put privatization back on the agenda to open up these sectors back to the market in order for them to profit from. And of course, the left had no perspective of that. For them, they just thought socialism was this kind of straight line, ever up and up. Now, I should make clear that as Marxists, when criticizing the reformists, we're not against reforms. In fact, we're for any advance that actually improves the lives of working class people, and we'll be at the forefront of the struggle to achieve them. And really, the struggle for socialism would be impossible without that. But what we're against is the idea that capitalism can simply be turned into socialism, and that a revolution isn't necessary. Now, as well as fighting for any reforms, no matter how small, we always have to point out that so long as capitalism is left intact, what the capitalists are forced to concede with one hand, they'll claw back as soon as they're in a position to be able to do so. And we point out that capitalism cannot be managed so as to avoid crises. They're an inevitable feature of the system. And that the class struggle under capitalism cannot be legislated away. Now, there have been periods under capitalism where there's been an upswing which has given the capitalists more room for manoeuvre. And of course, they can give them more crumbs from the table in order to try and buy social peace. But when capitalism enters into crisis, as it must, then a bitter struggle opens up. As ultimately, the capitalist profits are based on the exploitation of the working class. And the class struggle is ultimately a struggle over who controls the surplus produced by workers. If workers achieve higher wages, then all else being equal, it will mean a fall in profits and vice versa. And therefore, the bitter legacy of labour in power has meant that all the reforms that they were able to implement during the post-war period have either been clawed back by the capitalists or are in the process of being stripped away. Because at the end of the day, they left the capitalists in power. What is left of the nationalised industries, of council housing, of access to university, although the NHS still formally exists, it's really, to all real purposes, in a state of complete collapse. And this is really a product of the fact that the system itself has reached its limits, and it can no longer develop the productive forces as it could in the past. And in order to restore profitability, the capitalists are forced to tighten the screws on the working class. Now, there are some people who just pass that off as what they call neoliberalism, i.e. just the idea that this is like a nasty set of policies or a nasty government, implying that we just need to go back to the policies of the post-war Labour government and all our problems could be solved. But actually, it was the post-war boom which gave the material basis for those policies, and that was the exception and not the norm. And that came to an end with the worldwide crisis of capitalism in the 70s. And ever since then, the capitalists have attacked all the gains of that period in order to restore their profits. So whilst the reformists accuse us Marxists of being utopians and as being revolution being unrealistic, it's really the history of the Labour Party in power that shows that it's precisely reformism that is the real utopia, the idea that they can peacefully and gradually reform their way to socialism. And I think their chief defect is that they don't base themselves on a consciously revolutionary philosophy, meaning that they consciously or unconsciously adopt the outlook and ideas of the ruling class. And they've got no real perspective of where they're heading, they just respond to events empirically. So instead of laying the basis for socialism, the Labour Party would come to power when the Tories are discredited, they would manage capitalism on behalf of the bosses, and in the process they would discredit themselves, just simply preparing the ground for the Tories to come back into power. And that is precisely the role that Starmer is playing now, one of managing capitalism in crisis on behalf of the bosses. Already Labour has completely lost its lead in the opinion polls. It's actually behind the Tories now, according to some. Starmer is incredibly popular. Why? Because he's doing nothing to address the declining living standards of millions of workers. There's this widespread feeling that Britain is literally falling apart. You know, our infrastructure and services are falling into ruin, and no matter how hard you work, it's still impossible to pay the bills. All the while, the bosses and landlords are laughing all the way to the bank. And Starmer is correctly seen as being on their side, as part of the establishment, which is deeply discredited. And in fact, I think given the crisis in the Tories, Starmer is likely preparing the conditions for Raj's Reform Party to become a major force in British politics once Labour has fulfilled their role on behalf of the bosses, in the same way that the Democrats in the USA have simply prepared the ground for Trump. Now, I just want to end by saying there is another side to this, which is that he's also discrediting not just the Labour Party and reformism, but actually bourgeois democracy as a whole. Because in the eyes of millions, no matter who you elect, you effectively get the same government in power with just different faces. Your living standards are still declining, services and infrastructure are still crumbling, and all while the rich are getting richer and richer. And that really means that more and more people are being forced to question capitalism, and there's a layer of them who are increasingly looking and open towards communism as an alternative. And that is our burning task, is to find those people, organise them in a revolutionary party, train them in the revolutionary ideas of Marxism, and in doing so prepare for the coming British Revolution.
Thanks for listening, comrades. If you want to learn more about this topic, then follow the links in the episode description. As Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. But it's not enough to just study the ideas of Marxism. You need to get organised in a force that's capable of connecting those to the living struggle. So if you're listening to this podcast and you agree with the ideas, but you're not yet a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, then go to communist.red/join and help us in the fight for revolution.